In 1832, a newspaper article in Minnesota's Annual Register detailed how an expedition was sent in to explore the Rocky Mountains only 2 years prior. Now, during this expedition, the team happened upon a tribe of natives that they would describe were wild and covered in hair. In fact, they were so feral, they were compelled to run them down with horses until this happened. Now, before we go any further, we need to understand something. Roughly speaking, there are two lines of thought in cryptozoology. That Sasquatch is a flesh and blood mammal and completely natural yet highly elusive, and that Sasquatch exhibits talents more supernatural than anything else in the animal kingdom. Adherents to the latter theory point to a host of anomalies which don't add up when viewed through the naturalistic lens. Trackways suddenly end in the middle of open fields. Bigfoot eyes seem to glow with an internal light. The creatures vanish into thin air when spotted or seem to cloak themselves in a transparent sheen. Witnesses describe Sasquatch seen in the company of ghost lights, UFOs, and mysterious rips in the fabric of reality that can only be described as interdimensional portals. One of the more controversial opinions holds that encountering Bigfoot is accompanied by a curse. These superstitions can be traced back to the First Nations folklore, where certain tribes translate the creature's name as bad luck spirit. In northwestern California, for example, the Hoopa tribe believe that making eye contact with a Omaha can lead to misfortune or even death. These beliefs persist to this day among tribe members. Sharing one of his many sightings on the Sasquatch Chronicles podcast, Kwa Kakiwak, bush guide Tom Seawood told about how he had a Bigfoot trained in his sights on his rifle when his conscience kept him from pulling the trigger. "You know the stories from your people, the curse," he said to himself. "If you harm or disrespect or kill a big fellow, if nothing happens to you bad, something will happen to the family or loved ones around you." But what about actual examples of Sasquatch curses? Have any fully played out, and have they been accurately documented? Perhaps the first historical record of a Sasquatch curse unfolding could be found in 1832, as mentioned before. Minnesota's Annual Register described how an expedition was sent to explore the Rocky Mountains. During the exploration, the team happened upon a tribe of hairy natives so feral and wild that they actually decided to run them down with their horses. Now, for this transgression, it seems that the expedition was cursed. While many of the era's explorers met with tragedy, this band of men suffered more than usual. The article concludes that by declaring that, of the company, 5 died by sickness, 1 by breaking a wild horse, 1 by the fall of a tree, and 15 were killed by the natives, total of 22. 10 of the 19 survivors are lame, some by accident. Another early example comes from none other than the famous American pioneer Davy Crockett. In a letter addressed to Abner Bergen in 1836, Crockett wrote the following: "William and I were pushing through some thicket, clearing the way, when I sat down to mop my brow. I sat for a spell, watching as William made his good and fine progress. I removed my boots and sat with my rations, thinking the afternoon a fine time to lunch. As the birds whistled and chirped and I ate my small and meager ration, I tapped my axe upon the opposite end of the felled tree that I rested upon. Whether it was the axe's disturbance or possibly the heat of the high sun, which caused an apparition to slowly form in front of my eyes, I know not. As a Christian man, I swear to you, Abe, that what spirit came upon me was the shape and shade of a large ape-man, the likes we might expect among the more bellicose and hostile native tribes of the territories. The shade formed into the most deformed and ugly countenance, covered in wild hair with small and needling eyes, large broken rows of teeth, and the height of 3 foundlings. I spit upon the ground the bread I was eating. The monster then addressed a warning to me. Abner, it told me to return from Texas, to flee this fort, and to abandon this lost cause. When I began to question this, the creature spread upon the wind like the morning steam swirls off a frog pond. I swear to you, Abner, that whatever meat or sausage disagreed with me that afternoon, I forswore all beef and hog for a day or so afterward. Many, of course, suspect that Crockett was simply telling a tall tale. Either way, true or not, Davy Crockett met his fate at the hands of the Mexican army later that year while defending the Alamo. Curses need not always end in death. Sometimes people who encounter Sasquatch simply find their lives ruined. Such was the case with a young indigenous girl whose brush with Bigfoot was chronicled by anthropologist Dead Push. Now, according to Bush, the girl was aged between 14 and 18 when a Bigfoot had abducted her from her tribe. The creature seemed attracted to the smell of virgins. The missing girl's people mounted an exhaustive search for her, but wound up empty-handed. Once 2 to 3 years had passed, the girl returned, but smelt like a Sasquatch. The stench was so revolting that nobody wanted anything to do with her. To make matters worse, she appeared to have lost her mind during her time with her hairy captor, emerging more animalistic than human. Whether by natural or supernatural means, the result was the same. Her life was ruined and she was essentially cursed. 2 examples of the Sasquatch curse are worthy of their own special mention: the Ruby Creek incident and the strange tale of Charlie Victor. Now, one of the most sinister and infamous examples of the Sasquatch curse comes from the files of cryptozoologist Ivan Sanderson. He had the opportunity to speak with the Chapmans, an indigenous family from British Columbia residing a half-mile east of a settlement called Ruby Creek. Dubbed the Ruby Creek Incident, it constitutes one of the best examples where witnesses suffered negative effects after seeing a Bigfoot. It was September 1941. The Chapman family, George, Janie, and their children occupied a modest homestead along western Canada's Fraser River. They were themselves rather isolated, the nearest town of notable size being the small community of Agassiz, 10 miles to the southwest as the crow flies. While George went to his job on the railroad, Janie would watch their children as they played in the picturesque fields all around the river. Janie recalled that the weather that day had simply been perfect. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, allowing the sun to beam down and fend off the first hints of autumn. The days were growing shorter, but there was still plenty of time for the children to enjoy their unsupervised time exploring around the home, playing in the empty field bordering the railroad track to the rear of the property. It was around 3 o'clock in the afternoon when George and Janie's oldest son, aged 9, burst into the home at full speed. His siblings, a 7-year-old brother and a 5-year-old sister, were still outside. Now, Janie was startled by her son's excitement, but after taking a moment to recover, was able to ask him what all the fuss was about. Her son breathlessly told her that a cow had meandered down from the adjacent mountain. He had watched as it stepped out from the tree line and into their sight. Now, immediately, Janie sensed that something was amiss. While a stray cow was certainly odd, it shouldn't have caused her son such alarm. His agitation prompted her to take a look outside, and that is when she saw it. Whatever it was not a cow. Janie's first inclination was that she was watching a bear, a very big bear, bumbling through the bushes bordering the field. She watched for a few seconds as the shaggy figure traced a path in the bush along the field's perimeter, near the railway tracks, before calling to her other children. Life in the wilderness of British Columbia had afforded her the opportunity to see what bears were capable of, and she was deathly terrified for the safety of her sons and daughter. The younger children joined their mother and their sibling by the cabin. With her children safely by her side, Janie last allowed herself a closer look, and a slow horror washed over her. It wasn't a cow, but it wasn't a bear either. The thing it seemed to resemble most was a man covered head to toe in hair. It stepped from the obscurity of the bushes and onto the railroad, allowing her to get a better look. The creature's coat seemed to be uniformly about 4 inches long and was a pale yellowish-brown color, the hue of lightly varnished plywood. Janie's blood ran cold as the beast pivoted on the railroad tracks in the direction of her family. It seemed to have noticed them and began taking steps directly towards their home. As it closed the distance, Janie said she had, in her words, much too much time to look at it. The Sasquatch stood about 7.5 feet tall. It was easy for Janie to estimate the creature's height because of its proximity to several fence-lined posts that stood throughout the field. Its body closely resembled that of a human being, except noticeably thicker through the chest, with arms longer than they should have been. more ape than human. Now atop this massive frame sat a disproportionately small head and a neck that was either short and thin or absent entirely. The only portions of its body devoid of hair were its face and palms of its hands, which were notably darker than its fur, to the point of it being nearly black. There was no way for Janie to determine its sex, as neither breasts nor genitalia were evident, but she nonetheless sensed an intimidating masculine ferocity from the beast. The mother and her children stood their ground for a few tense moments before Janie commanded her eldest son to run inside and fetch a blanket from the house. By this point, her children were on the verge of panicking, and intense fear slowly grew during the 2 or 3 minutes it took him to return. The creature continued to draw closer and closer, reaching the nearest corner of the field, a mere 100 feet away now. At last, the eldest Chapman's son returned with the blanket and handed it to his mother with shaking hands. He is petrified. She quickly unfolds the blanket and held it between her children and the creature, shielding their eyes from the horrible apparition and vice versa. As rapidly as she could, given this awkward arrangement, Janie and the Chapman children shuffled back into the opposite field, not stopping until they reached the sandy banks of the river below. Not even Janie could see the Sasquatch now. The immediate threat averted, she drug her kids along the beach to the safety of the village downstream. Upon hearing this detail regarding the blanket, Ivan Sanderson asked Janie what had motivated her to take this unorthodox course of action. Was it, as he had heard, the result of indigenous superstition that to see a Bigfoot guaranteed bad luck, or worse, death itself? Janie told Sanderson that she had heard about the hairy men since childhood, but that the belief it was too dangerous to see one of them had predominantly come from white men, not her family's tribal lore. Instead, her people mostly advised avoiding the Sasquatch at all costs. This meant detouring around certain points in specific valleys where they were known to dwell. Should she be unfortunate enough to encounter one, her parents informed her to not run away, but simply stay still or back away slowly. If she was even more unlucky and found herself seized by one of these creatures, the best course of action was to resist the urge to struggle, as doing so might cause the Sasquatch to tighten its grip and suffocate her to death. Instead, Janie's motivation for the blanket was a clever ruse to lure the creature away from her family. She believed that the Sasquatch was interested in one of her children and thought that by hiding them from its line of sight, she might trick the monster into thinking that they had gone inside the house. While the prospect of having a Bigfoot loose in your home might not sound too appealing, it would at least provide enough of a distraction to facilitate their escape. Now, as it turns out, Janie's logic proved correct, or at least it seems to. While they were away in town, George Chapman returned from work around 6 o'clock in the evening, and what he found terrified him. First and foremost, there was no sign of his wife and children. Something had ransacked the Chapman home, battering in the door to the woodshed in a fit of rage, and even rummaging through the old outhouse. Whatever had done this must have been immeasurably strong, as it had drug a 55-gallon barrel of saltfish out into the yard. The barrel had been cracked open, scattering everything within across the ground. Enormous footprints crisscrossed through the mud, evidence which George would later share with others in the Ruby Creek community in the coming days. George was greatly distressed. Like his wife, he had grown up hearing stories surrounding the big wild men of the mountains. Even if he had never encountered them firsthand, were the stories true? And if so, had one of these monsters abducted his family? To George's relief, he soon noticed several smaller sets of footprints in the ground around the home, a stark contrast to the massive bare feet of the creature that had ransacked his property. He soon realized that these were the tracks of Janie and their children. It looked like they had escaped. George followed the trail as it wound through the far field and down towards the river, and here in the sandy soil, he was able to make out their footprints clearer than ever. His heart leapt for joy as he realized that none of the larger, shoeless footprints were anywhere to be found down by the water. His wife and kids had made it downstream and had not been followed. George allowed himself a few moments' worth of investigation, retracing their path back upstream. Farther up the riverbank, the Sasquatch tracks reappeared. From what George could tell, The beast had stumbled out of his potato patch between the house and the river, wandered about for a little while, perhaps wondering where the prey had disappeared, and returned back to the field. The trackway vanished in the thicker undergrowth that skirted the foot of the mountain. George then returned to the home to assess the damage before resuming his own search for his family. When he spoke to Ivan Sanderson, 18 years later, he was still impressed by the sheer strength on display. According to Sanderson, George Chapman still expressed voluble astonishment that any living thing, even a 7-foot 6-inch man with a barrel chest, could lift a 55-gallon tub of fish and break it open without using a tool. George was able to corroborate Janie's estimation of the creature's height after finding a series of long brown hairs clinging to the slabwood lintel of the doorway, which stood well above his own head. His property secure at last, George set off towards town to relocate his family. He found them, in Sanderson's words, in a state of calm collapse. Reassuring Janie and the children, George gathered them up and brought them home, asking Janie's father and 2 others to come stay at the homestead for quite a while to offer them peace of mind and protection while he was away working on the railroad. They also brought some dogs in, hopefully to serve as an alarm system or deterrent should the creature return. These were wise decisions, it would seem, because this was not the last Sasquatch encounter that the Chapman family would endure. For a week afterward, fresh footprints could be found each morning, cool dew still clinging onto the indentations. On 2 separate occasions, the family's new dog set off barking and wailing at 2 o'clock in the morning, as if an intruder were present. On some evenings, the racket caused by the dogs was accompanied by what Janie Chapman called an awful funny noise, a strange gurgling whistle. However, this was the extent of their subsequent visitations. The creature was never seen again, nor did it attempt to make any harm to their property or their pets. Despite the newfound peace, the Chapmans could not bear to remain at their home any longer. They decided the best thing to do was to move elsewhere and start a new life a little further away. They never did return to their homestead along the river. But this is a story about the Sasquatch curse. The Chapmans were not allowed to have a happy ending. Within 3 years' time, all 3 of the children involved in the September 1941 sighting were lost. The 2 sons passed away in a horrible drowning accident, while the daughter succumbed to an undisclosed illness. Even George and Janie Chapman weren't able to escape their fate. Shortly after their interview with Ivan T. Sanderson in 1959, their rowboat capsized while traveling the Fraser River. Both parents were lost beneath the rapids. Cryptozoologists like Loren Coleman, who adhere to the idea that Bigfoot is a flesh and blood creature and dismissive of Sasquatch curses in general, Coleman himself finds attaching a curse to the Ruby Creek incident especially problematic. He correctly points out that the Chapman children did not die immediately after their sighting. It took 3 years, and that George and Janie died nearly a full 18 years after the experience. Not exactly the sort of immediacy one would expect from a supernatural curse, right? Yet, who can deny that losing 3 children in 3 years isn't absolutely uncanny? Far beyond the rate of mortality one should reasonably expect in the early mid-20th century, right? Moreover, George and Janie Chapman's death in such close proximity to discussing their sighting should be viewed within the broader context of indigenous beliefs worldwide, where simply speaking about supernatural creatures can provoke and invite their wrath. In Western Europe, it was ill-advised to speak of fairies unless you wanted to draw their anger. If one simply had to discuss them, best practice involved employing a number of euphemisms. The good people, the fair folk, the gentry, etc. Similar beliefs were once common among New World tribes when discussing lake monsters who, if spoken of, could inflict illness upon the community. We even find this practice play out with how some indigenous North American tribes speak about Bigfoot. The Tlingit of Alaska's southern coastal region hold that a creature exists known as the Kushtaka, a shape-shifting otter man, which some cryptozoologists believe is analogous to Bigfoot. The word Kushtaka was often avoided, spoken only when going to war or expecting one's imminent death. When someone was forced to speak about the Kushtaka outside of this context, the word could be avoided by referring to them with the phrase, "we who live at the point." Did the Chapman children succumb to the curse of seeing a Sasquatch? Did George and Janie Chapman rekindle the curse by discussing their experiences with Ivan T. Sanderson? The answer might simply depend upon one's perspective. In 1929, journalist J.W. Burns had the opportunity to sit down with Charlie Victor for an interview that would appear in the April edition of Maclean's magazine. Over the course of their conversation, Burns learned that Charlie had not always been the broken old man he appeared to be, and that his current state was thanks to a chance meeting with the unknown. In his younger days, Charlie Victor was known as one of the best hunters among his fellow tribespeople in the Squaw Reserve near Chilliwack, British Columbia. While he had enjoyed countless adventures in the Canadian wilderness, his encounters with the hairy ape-like men of the mountains were among his most thrilling and terrifying. Charlie told Burns that he had heard numerous stories over the years and had even on one occasion stumbled into what he believed to be a Sasquatch den. And that is not all, he added. I met and spoke to one of their women. It was around 1914, and Charlie was hunting in the mountains near Hattzik. For companionship, he had his loyal hunting dog, and the two were taking in their picturesque scenery when they found themselves in an area they had not visited before. The mountainside had given way to a broad plateau, interspersed with several massive cedar trees. Charlie watched his dog sniff the air and trot towards one of the trees. When he reached the trunk, he began growling and barking as if he had sensed something there. Charlie followed his canine companion's interest and surveyed the tree for himself, eventually noticing a large hole in the trunk about 7 feet off the forest floor. It was this feature that seemed to interest the dog the most. Now, by now, his pet was bounding at the tree, pawing and leaping up into the bark in an attempt to reach the hole. Suspecting there might be some game worth bagging inside, Charlie lifted the dog high enough so that it could scramble into the hole of the trunk. The dog disappeared inside, eager to satisfy its curiosity. Within moments, Charlie detected the sound of something else within the hole. It sounded like the muffled cry of another animal. Charlie suspected a small bear, maybe a cub, had barricaded itself inside and eagerly began calling the dog back out. As he did so, he readied his rifle, uncertain of what might emerge. Out leapt a blurry shape, a figure which Charlie assumed to be a bear. He instinctively pulled the trigger, unsure whether he was acting in self-defense or had merely snagged himself tonight's supper. To his abject horror, it was neither. The shape plummeted to the ground with a thud, felled by Charlie's bullet. Lying there on the ground was, of all things, a naked boy. He was white, seemed to be between 12 and 14 years of age, and had a head of thick, woolly black hair. Charlie was now convinced he had just committed murder. Thankfully, the boy had only been wounded but needed serious medical attention ASAP. Charlie dropped to his knees to examine the extent of the boy's injury, but as he did so, the child released a hellish yell. It was absolutely spine-chilling. The boy must be in profound agony. As the child's voice droned on, however, he realized this scream wasn't filled with pain. It was laced with anger and something else. A cry for help. That was when, from far across the valley, something answered the boy's cry. It sounded like thunder itself, rolling over the mountainside with a power Charlie had never heard before. For around half an hour, the boy refused to let Charlie come any closer, instead continuing this call and response with whatever was answering. The distant bellows drew nearer and nearer, louder and louder as the minutes dragged on. It soon became apparent that the boy was calling upon something to come to his aid. Finally, from out of the darkness near the forest edge, Charlie spots a second figure. Now, he described it as the strangest and wildest creature one could possibly see. A hairy person was confidently striding towards the scene of the accident. Broad-shouldered, standing around 6 feet tall, Charlie fearfully raised his rifle, not wanting to cause further harm, but ready to defend himself if he must. Once the being had come near enough, Charlie was able to make out additional features. It was a hairy female whose face he compared to someone of African descent. The hair on her head hung in long, flowing locks that reached down to her waistline. While he had spied similar creatures from a distance in the past, this one terrified him in a way no others had before. She seemed full of righteous anger. and Charlie knew that should his weapon misfire or become lost, he would never stand a chance, declaring that, in my time, this is no boast. I have in more than one emergency strangled bears with my hands, but I'm sure if this wild woman laid hands on me, she'd break every bone in my body. The creature cast a quick glance in the direction of the boy, saw his wound, then returned her eyes back to Charlie. Her face contorted in a grimace of rage, and to his absolute surprise, spoke to him in his own Douglas dialect. "You have shot my friend." Charlie was dumbfounded. He mustered the presence of mind to stumble out of sentence in Douglas himself, explaining that he had mistaken the boy for a bear and that he was sorry beyond words. His explanation did little to change the creature's disposition. Without replying, she instead focused her attention to the boy approaching his side. Once she was near enough, she began a frantic dance around him, chanting and wailing in a loud voice. And she did so. Other voices welled up from the deep within the forest, joining in a horrific chorus that left Charlie unsure of how to react. From time to time, she would stop and shout, "Yahoo! Yahoo!" into the woods, and would always receive a reply in kind from farther up the mountainside. It was at this point that Charlie noticed that the wild woman held something in her hand. It was long, slick, and sinewy, and to his dying day, Charlie was not sure whether it was a snake or a length of an animal intestine. Either way, she used this implement to repetitively strike the ground around the boy. When she finally stopped, she effortlessly picked up the child with a single hand. When speaking with Burns, Charlie Victor became introspective at this point in his story. He seemed hesitant to elaborate upon what came next, but eventually finished the tale, saying, "Perhaps I better tell you the rest of it, although I know you'll not believe it." There was challenge of defiance in her black eyes and dark looks as she raced and spoke to me a second time, and the dreadful words she used set me shaking. They still ring around my old ears like the echo of a thunderstorm. She pointed the snake-like thing at me and said, "Siwash, you'll never kill another bear." Her words, expression, and the savage, avenging glint in her dark, fiery eyes filled me with fear, and I felt so exhausted from her unwavering gaze that I was no longer able to keep her covered with my rifle. I let it drop. The entire time, her fearless dog, which never turned from any bear nor cougar, according to Charlie, simply cowered at his feet, almost as if understood the words of her curse. Both owner and pet were left standing on the plateau, emotionally broken, as the creature apparently melted back into the forest with her young ward in tow. The story is absolutely bizarre and raises so many questions. Was this creature a Sasquatch capable of human speech? What was the long object that she was holding? What was the nature of the arcane ritual she was performing? Do Bigfoot practice magic? And perhaps most peculiarly, what was her relationship to this child? Charlie dismissed the notion that the boy that he wounded was anything other than a human being because, according to him, the child was white and she called him her friend. They must have stolen him or run across him in some other way, he decided. Charlie also felt that, given the way the wild woman spoke to him in his native Douglas tongue, she must have somehow been related to his people. It's worth noting that the curse she inflicted upon Charlie took effect immediately. He told J.W. Burns that he had not only failed to kill another bear, but his entire hunting career had been cut short. He never bagged another trophy after that day in 1914. Moreover, Charlie was inflicted with partial paralysis 7 years afterward, an affliction that he was convinced stemmed from his encounter with the Sasquatch witch. Even if seeing a Sasquatch doesn't directly result in a literal curse, the after effects of a sighting can certainly seem like one. Stories abound of witnesses who lapse into substance abuse, lose their jobs, or find themselves unable to enter the forest ever again. Misfortunes caused either by their own post-traumatic stress or the ridicule heaped upon them. These afflictions might be amplified by the power of the human mind. Belief can be just as potent as any supernatural ailment, especially negative belief. Now, bear that in mind, should you become so lucky or unlucky to encounter North America's wild men of the woods. If you've enjoyed this quick look at Bigfoot curses or are interested in the paranormal abilities sometimes attributed to Sasquatch, many of these stories can be found in Joshua Cutchin and Timothy Renner's two-part series Where the Footprint Ends, High Strangeness, and the Bigfoot Phenomenon. But more importantly, what do you guys think? Are Bigfoot curses a real thing? Is there even such a thing as Bigfoot and Sasquatch? Or is this whole thing just tall tales and elaborate hoaxes? I want to know your thoughts and opinions, so please leave them in the comments down below. And if you guys enjoyed today's content, be sure to go ahead and slap that like and subscribe button if you are not subscribed already. And as always, I love you all. Keep an open mind, and I'll check you guys out in the next episode.